And the story of the Second World War is filled with tales of unexpected twists of fate, where men who seemed destined for destruction instead found themselves reborn in ways no one could have imagined. And this is one such story, the story of a Luftwaffe ace who faced capture, humiliation, and an almost certain death, only to find his enemies would place him in a cockpit once more. He was a young man when he first soared into the clouds, and, wearing the eagle insignia of the Luftwaffe, like so many others of his generation, he had been promised glory, adventure, and the chance to defend the fatherland in the most prestigious of ways as a fighter pilot. And the air battles of the Second World War were unlike anything seen before. Machines of steel and fire clashed in the skies over Europe, and the Luftwaffe produced some of the most lethal pilots in aviation history. Men who racked up astonishing kill counts, and whose faces appeared in German propaganda as heroes. But when the tide of war shifted, these same aces faced an entirely different fate. Shot down, and captured and branded enemies, they were marched off in chains. Some would never return. Others endured starvation and endless captivity in the Soviet Union. And, for one Luftwaffe ace, capture meant not only disgrace, but the very real possibility of death. His enemies could have executed him on the spot, or delivered him to the Red Army, where thousands of Germans perished in the gulags. And yet, something strange happened. Instead of facing a bullet, he was offered something that seemed almost unthinkable, the chance to fly again. Not for Germany, but for America. And the world of the Luftwaffe aces. The Luftwaffe was born out of secrecy. In the years following the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from maintaining an air force. But under Adolf Hitler, those restrictions were cast aside. By the mid-1930s, the Luftwaffe had emerged as one of the most advanced air arms in the world. Young men flocked to it with dreams of adventure and heroism, and they were trained ruthlessly, with high attrition rates. Only the best survived long enough to see combat. Those who did, and who managed to down 5 or more enemy aircraft, were honored with the coveted title of ace. The Luftwaffe's greatest aces became legends. Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight, scored an almost unbelievable 352 aerial victories. Gerhard Bachhorn followed closely behind, with over 300. And men like Adolf Galland and Werner Meloders became household names. But alongside these giants were countless others. Skilled and courageous pilots who fought just as fiercely, but whose names are now largely forgotten. They flew day after day, often against overwhelming numbers. And with each sortie the odds of survival grew slimmer. By 1944 and 1945, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Fuel was scarce, and replacements were rushed into combat with minimal training, and Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Even the most skilled aces were being hunted down. And the fall of our story centers on one of these men. A decorated Luftwaffe ace, he had survived countless missions, duels with American and British fighters, and bombing raids that left the German countryside in ruins. But the skies grew more dangerous with each passing month. On a fateful day in 1944, and his aircraft was struck. Some accounts say it was Allied anti-aircraft fire. Others suggest a P-51 Mustang caught him in its gun sights. And what is certain is that his machine went down, smoke trailing across the sky. He bailed out, and parachuting into territory already crawling with advancing Allied forces. Armed civilians spotted him first, and, furious at the destruction the Luftwaffe had brought to their towns, he was beaten, jeered, and threatened with death before American troops intervened. And he was now a prisoner of war. For a Luftwaffe ace, this was a deeply dishonorable fate. These men were supposed to fight to the death or be killed in action. Capture meant humiliation, and with the war nearing its bloody conclusion, many prisoners feared the worst. Some German officers were executed on the spot, and others were handed over to the Soviets, where death in a labor camp was almost guaranteed. But for this ace, fate took an extraordinary turn, and America's hidden motives, the United States was already looking ahead, not only to the final defeat of Germany, but to the world that would follow. And the war had introduced terrifying new technologies: jet fighters, rocket aircraft, guided missiles. And the Germans were years ahead of the Allies in many of these fields. In 1945, the U.S. launched a secretive effort known as Operation Lusty. Luftwaffe secret technology. American intelligence officers swept through defeated Germany and, seizing advanced aircraft, prototypes, and mountains of research, they wanted not just the machines, but the men who knew how to fly and build them. And, at the same time, another secret program was forming, Operation Paperclip. Under this initiative, and German scientists and engineers, many of them with deep ties to the Nazi regime, were quietly transported to the United States. There, and they would continue their work, not for Hitler, but for Washington. The best-known example was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket. And he and his team would eventually help launch America's space program. But Operation Lusty had another component. It sought not just scientists, but Luftwaffe pilots, men with first-hand experience flying Germany's revolutionary aircraft. And American intelligence turned to prisoners like the ace at the heart of our story. Instead of execution or endless imprisonment, and he was given a startling proposal: fly again. This time, for the United States. From prisoner to test pilot, the ace was transferred across the Atlantic. And, for a German soldier, being shipped to America as a prisoner of war was a strange fate. And thousands of POWs spent the final months of the war in camps scattered across the American Midwest and South. They worked on farms, in factories, and even alongside ordinary American civilians. But for a select few, life took a different course. In guarded airfields, and German pilots were handed the controls of their own machines once more. Captured Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, Focke-Wulf Fu-190s, and other advanced aircraft were brought to America for testing. Who better to reveal their secrets than the men who had mastered them in combat? And the ace became one of these test pilots. He flew in American skies, sometimes wearing civilian clothing, sometimes still in fragments of his Luftwaffe gear. And American engineers and officers peppered him with questions. How did the Me-262 handle at high speed? What tactics did German pilots use against the Allies? And what weaknesses did the Luftwaffe discover in their own designs? It was a surreal existence. Just weeks earlier, and he had been trying to kill these same men in aerial combat. Now, he was their partner in exploration. Not all Americans were comfortable with this arrangement, and to many, the idea of enemy pilots, men who had served Hitler, flying over U.S. soil was nothing short of treasonous. And families who had lost sons in Europe could not understand why their killers were now being protected and employed. But the logic of war had shifted, and the Nazis were finished, but a new enemy was rising: the Soviet Union. The Cold War was beginning before the Second World War had even fully ended, and in this new contest, German expertise was a prize too valuable to ignore. For the Luftwaffe ace, this meant survival, but at a cost. And he could never return to Germany as a hero. To many of his countrymen, he was a traitor. To Americans, he was a useful tool, but never fully trusted. And he lived in the shadows of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. By the late 1940s, the usefulness of these former Luftwaffe pilots began to fade, and American aviators had mastered the jet age. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf designs were studied, their secrets absorbed, and new generations of American aircraft surpassed them. Some of the German pilots were quietly repatriated to their homeland, and where they struggled to adapt to a Germany in ruins. Others remained in America under assumed identities, working in aviation or fading into obscurity. And our ace's story ended in ambiguity. Some accounts suggest he returned to Germany and lived quietly, rarely speaking of his wartime experiences. And others claim he stayed in the United States, blending into civilian life under a new name. And what is clear is that he escaped the fate that claimed so many of his comrades. He had been spared death, spared imprisonment, and given wings once again, but at the price of living a life forever divided by loyalty and survival. He was barely out of boyhood when the world changed around him and swept him into the sky. And the Luftwaffe, rising from the ashes of a humiliated Germany, promised its young pilots glory, discipline, and the chance to defend the fatherland from enemies on every side. He was one of those who answered the call, trained in the strict and unforgiving schools where only the most talented survived. Long hours in the cockpit, endless drills, and the looming shadow of death created a breed of aviators who were both admired and feared. In the early years of the war, and they were celebrated like knights of a new age, their photographs placed on posters and newspapers, and their victories counted as if they were sportsmen chasing records rather than men fighting to the death. As the war dragged on, he rose among their ranks. And he was not the most famous nor the most decorated, but he was skilled, disciplined, and respected by comrades who knew just how fragile survival in the skies had become. He learned to duel with Hurricanes and Spitfires, and then Mustangs and Thunderbolts, machines that outnumbered and outlasted anything Germany could put into the air. Every mission was a gamble, and fuel shortages meant that sometimes aircraft were filled with barely enough for one sortie. Spare parts were scavenged, and maintenance crews worked miracles to keep machines in the sky, and through it all, he fought on, because to stop was to admit defeat, and to be shot down was almost inevitable. The day came when his luck finally broke. His fighter was hit, some said by anti-aircraft fire, and others swore it was a Mustang's burst that caught him in the fuselage. Smoke poured from the engine, controls shuddered, and the cockpit filled with choking fumes. He had seconds to make a choice. Pulling the canopy release, and he flung himself into the rushing air and trusted the parachute to save him. The ground rushed up, and when he landed, he found himself in a world that no longer belonged to him. Armed civilians surrounded him, their eyes filled with rage. And to them he was not a warrior, but a symbol of everything that had rained fire on their homes. Blows rained down, shouts echoed, and for a moment he thought his end had come there in a muddy field far from home. American soldiers intervened, dragging him away from the mob. And now he was a prisoner, stripped of his weapon, his uniform torn, his pride broken. Captivity for a Luftwaffe ace was no small humiliation, and he had been trained to fight to the last bullet, to prefer death to surrender. Yet here he was, alive but powerless. And rumors among the prisoners whispered of executions, of summary trials, and of men shipped east to vanish in Soviet camps where starvation and cold claimed more lives than bullets ever could. And he expected little more than a slow end behind barbed wire, but instead a strange turn of fate carried him across the ocean. Shipped to America, and he entered a world utterly foreign. Thousands of German prisoners found themselves in camps across the American heartland, and guarded but treated with a measure of humanity that surprised many. They worked in fields, repaired roads, and lived lives that seemed far removed from the devastation of Europe. Yet for a select few, men who carried not only rank but knowledge, and there was something else waiting. The Americans had plans, and they were already thinking beyond the war. And the collapse of the Reach revealed machines unlike anything the Allies had yet built. Jet fighters like the Messerschmitt 262, and rocket planes that brushed the edge of space, guided weapons that hinted at a new kind of warfare. The United States wanted more than trophies, and it wanted mastery. Under the banner of secret operations, teams gathered documents, blueprints, and above all, people. Engineers, scientists, and pilots were quietly removed from the ruins of Germany and placed into American hands. Some of them, like the scientists of Operation Paperclip, would go on to shape rockets, missiles, and even the future of space exploration. Others, like captured Luftwaffe pilots, were asked to share their experience in ways no textbook could capture, and so he found himself once more at the controls of the very machines he had flown in combat. And, on guarded airfields in America, German aircraft were rebuilt, tested, and studied. American officers wanted to know every detail. How did they climb? And how did they dive? How did they turn in combat? What weaknesses did they hide beneath their sleek designs? And no manual could explain what a pilot who had fought for his life could. Reluctantly, sometimes resentfully, he answered their questions. And he demonstrated maneuvers, explained tactics, and flew missions not of war but of research. It was a surreal transformation, and from sworn enemy to reluctant partner, and it left him in a twilight between two worlds to many Americans. And the very idea of allowing former Nazi pilots to fly over American soil was unthinkable. And families who had lost sons to Luftwaffe bullets saw betrayal in the bargain. Yet to the men who were already turning their eyes toward a new adversary, and the Soviet Union, these German captives were tools too valuable to discard. Survival had given him a second life, but it came with a burden he could never shake. He had grown up in a country consumed by promises of revival, and where every boy was told that sacrifice for the nation was the highest calling. As he watched the rise of the Luftwaffe, and sleek machines soaring across the sky in parades and demonstrations, he knew his path would not be on the ground. Training schools were brutal, and designed to break the weak and push the gifted until they reached their limits. Long days of flying drills, nights filled with study of tactics, and endless pressure to master bow machine in his own nerves. Out of hundreds who began, and only a fraction earned the right to wear the wings of a fighter pilot, and he was among them. And he carried the pride of youth and the belief that he would carve his name among the aces who dominated the skies of Europe. In the first years of war, and the Luftwaffe seemed unstoppable. They cut through Poland, Norway, France, and brought Britain itself to the edge of collapse. And propaganda posters celebrated pilots as knights of a new age, and in the barracks their names were spoken with reverence. He was still young, but he proved himself in combat. His kills mounted, his comrades trusted him, and for a while he believed the illusion that Germany could never fall. And yet the skies grew darker with every year. New enemy aircraft appeared, faster, deadlier, flown by pilots whose numbers seemed endless. And Allied bombers filled the heavens, their escorts swarming, and the German pilots were thrown again and again into hopeless battles. And the fuel that once flowed freely now trickled, engines sputtered, and the Luftwaffe began to crumble. His own story turned in an instant during one of those desperate missions. And he had taken off with barely enough fuel to fight, chasing American bombers high above the countryside. The formation of Mustangs pounced, and in the violent exchange of fire his aircraft was struck. The canopy shook with smoke, the instruments failed, and the machine that had once been his shield now became a death trap. With seconds to decide, he bailed out into the cold air. His parachute blossomed, and, carrying him down toward a land already filled with hostile eyes, the ground greeted him not with rescue but with fists and shouts. And civilians who had seen their homes destroyed by German raids recognized the insignia on his uniform. They struck him, spit at him, and he tasted for the first time what it meant to be utterly powerless. American soldiers arrived, pulling him from the mob, but he was not saved, and only captured life as a prisoner was a humiliation no Luftwaffe ace had been prepared for. Surrender was seen as weakness, as dishonor, and yet here he was, and behind barbed wire, watched by guards, his destiny stripped from him. He listened to whispers that some Germans had been shot out of hand, and that others had been handed to the Soviets, where men vanished into camps from which few ever returned. He imagined the years ahead filled with hunger, frost, and labor until death, and he wondered if his capture was not a slower execution than the bullet he might have taken in combat. But instead of that grim future, His fate bent toward something stranger. The Americans saw something in him beyond his value as a prisoner. Across Germany, and teams of intelligence officers scoured bases, hangars, and laboratories, gathering up documents, aircraft, and men. Jet planes like the Messerschmitt 262 and rocket-powered interceptors and weapons that seemed to belong to another century all fell into their hands, and they needed not just blueprints, but the living experience of those who had flown them in battle. And the United States was already preparing for the next struggle, one not against Berlin, but against Moscow, and every scrap of German knowledge was a weapon to be turned against a future rival. Under the quiet umbrella of secret projects, and German scientists and pilots were moved into American custody, asked to share what they knew, and, persuaded with offers of survival, he found himself transported far from Europe, across the ocean to a world he had only heard of, and, in camps across the American heartland, German prisoners cut fields, built roads, and lived lives strangely removed from the destruction overseas. And yet for him, chosen for his skill and experience, there was another path. In guarded hangars, he was led once more to the cockpit, and Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs stood under the eyes of American engineers, their wings marked not with crosses, but with stars. They asked him to fly them, and to explain their quirks, their strengths, their limits. He demonstrated maneuvers he had once used to kill their own countrymen, and now turned into lessons for the men who had defeated him. The irony was not lost on him. From prisoner to instructor, from enemy to reluctant ally, and his life had twisted in ways he could never have predicted. Not everyone in America accepted it. And families who had buried sons lost to German bullets recoiled at the thought of Nazi pilots flying over American soil. Politicians muttered about betrayal and about justice denied, but the demands of strategy were stronger than grief. The Cold War was already casting its shadow, and survival in that new world required knowledge that only men like him possessed. He became useful, not trusted, not embraced, but tolerated as a living resource. Every question he answered, every hour he spent in the cockpit, reminded him that his survival was not mercy but calculation. He had been spared not because of compassion, but because his skills could not yet be replaced. And so he continued, caught between two nations, belonging fully to neither, and living a life that was both gift and burden. He was raised in a Germany that was still licking its wounds from the Great War, and a country where bitterness and hope mixed uneasily. Children were taught that the nation had been betrayed, that dignity had been stolen, and that only strength could restore it. As he grew, he watched with wide eyes the parades of soldiers, the speeches that promised revival, and above all the spectacle of machines that clawed into the sky with thunder. The Luftwaffe was new and dazzling, and for a boy who dreamed of more than village streets, the chance to join it was irresistible. Training began when he was barely a man, and it was merciless, and long flights pushed him until his body ached. Instructors barked commands until every reflex was drilled into muscle memory, and accidents were frequent reminders that not everyone would survive even the preparation. Yet he endured, and when at last the badge of pilot was pinned to his chest, and he felt he had been chosen for something larger than himself, the war brought its own cruel education. In the early years, victory seemed effortless, and squadrons swept across Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying speed. He learned to duel in the sky, to read the movements of Spitfires and Hurricanes and later Mustangs, and he began to notch victories that earned him both respect and the hollow satisfaction of survival. And propaganda celebrated men like him, turning pilots into figures of myth. He felt pride when his name was mentioned. But even in those moments there's a shadow, because for every enemy that fell, another comrade was lost. And he learned to steel himself to the empty chairs at the mess hall, the lockers sealed forever, and the quick funerals whispered over wreckage by the middle of the war. the illusion of invincibility was gone. The Allies filled the skies with endless bombers and vast formations that blotted out the sun, and behind them swarms of escort fighters. German airfields were pounded day and night, fuel reserves dwindled, and engines failed for lack of parts, and pilots were sent up in aircraft patched together by desperate hands. And his missions became acts of endurance rather than glory. To climb into the cockpit was to wager everything, and he knew the odds leaned more heavily against him with every passing month. Still he fought, because stopping was unthinkable, and because survival was tied to loyalty, and because the Luftwaffe demanded it. Then came the mission that ended his war, and, ordered to intercept another wave of American bombers, he climbed with his squadron into the cold blue. Tracer fire filled the air, and explosions blossomed around him, and in the chaos his aircraft was struck. Smoke poured into the cockpit, instruments flickered and died, and the stick shook in his grip. He wrestled with the machine, but it betrayed him, flames licking at the fuselage. With seconds to spare, and he flung himself into the rushing wind. The parachute snapped open, and he drifted down toward fields that no longer belonged to him. On the ground, civilians rushed at him with rage, fists and boots punishing the uniform that marked him as an enemy. Blows fell, curses rang out, and he thought for a moment that his death would come not in combat, but in a muddy ditch. American soldiers intervened, dragging him away, and shackling his hands. He was alive, but his freedom was gone. The camp was not what he had expected. He had braced himself for starvation, brutality, perhaps execution. Instead, he found order, routine, a strange kind of stillness. Yet the humiliation of captivity cut deeper than hunger ever could. And he had been raised to believe surrender was dishonor, and now he sat behind wire, his fate in the hands of men he had tried to kill. And rumors spread among prisoners of summary executions, of transfers to Soviet camps where men vanished into snow and hunger, and of interrogations that broke spirits. He waited for the day his name would be called, and, fearing each morning that it might be his last, what came instead was something he could not have predicted. And the Americans had plans that stretched beyond the war itself. They combed through Germany's ruins, gathering machines and mines, seizing documents, prototypes, and the men who had built and flown them. Jets, rockets, guided weapons, and designs that seemed to leap ahead of their time all fell into Allied hands. But blueprints could only tell so much, and they needed the knowledge of those who had lived in the cockpit, who had tested the limits with their own flesh. And so, quietly, men like him were singled out. Instead of prison farms or endless confinement, he was shipped across the ocean and carried into a land untouched by the destruction that had scarred Europe. In America, he was brought not to a farm, but to airfields guarded closely, and where hangars held aircraft that once bore the black crosses of the Reach, the Messerschmitts, the Focke-Wulfs, and the jets that had terrified Allied crews now carried American markings, and engineers crowded around them with clipboards in hand. And they wanted to know everything, and he was expected to provide it. How they climbed, how they turned, what maneuvers could break pursuit, and how engines held under strain, what weaknesses pilots had whispered about in the barracks. Reluctantly he agreed, for he knew refusal carried risks, and survival demanded cooperation. Soon he was back in the cockpit, not as a warrior, but as a test subject, and guiding the very machines he had once trusted with his life under the watchful eyes of former enemies. It was a strange existence, and to sit in a cockpit again filled him with a rush he could not deny, but each flight reminded him of the contradiction he embodied. And American officers who questioned him remained polite but distant, never allowing him to forget that he was still a prisoner, and still a man who had fought for a cause they despised. Some civilians recoiled at the knowledge that German pilots were flying over American soil at all, and seeing it as betrayal of their dead. But to the strategists shaping the new order of the world, He was a resource too valuable to discard. And he lived in that uneasy space, tolerated but never trusted, useful yet always marked as the enemy he once was, and a man suspended between the pride of his past and the uncertainty of what awaited him next. He was born into a world where flight was still a dream for most, and yet in Germany of the 1930s the skies were filled with promises of power. Boys were told that the nation had been humiliated, and that only strength and sacrifice could restore it. The Luftwaffe became a symbol of that rebirth, sleek machines streaking across the sky, and engines howling like thunder, pilots saluted as knights of a new age. He was barely a man when he entered the training program, and a system designed to grind away weakness and leave only those with nerves of steel. The instructors offered no comfort, only endless drills and punishing flights and lectures about duty. Accidents were common, and many never even reached combat, but he endured. And when he finally earned the wings on his chest, he felt he had been chosen for something higher, and a destiny carried on the wind. The first missions gave him the thrill he had long imagined. Climbing into the cockpit, and feeling the vibration of the engine beneath him, the rush of takeoff, and the sudden silence of altitude, where only the roar of the propeller and the crackle of radio voices broke the emptiness. In those days, victories came quickly, and the Luftwaffe seemed invincible. German pilots shot down enemies in staggering numbers, and newspapers back home hailed them as heroes. He began to believe the myth himself, that he was part of a force that could not be broken. And he learned the tactics of dogfighting, the quick turns, the dives, the climbs that tested the limits of both machine and flesh. He watched comrades fall, but for a time he survived, and each survival deepened his confidence. Yet the war was changing. As the months passed, the skies grew more dangerous, and Allied bombers filled the horizon, massive flying fortresses dropping destruction on German cities. They came in endless streams, and with them came fighters that seemed faster, stronger, more numerous with each new year. The Luftwaffe, that had once ruled, now struggled to keep pace, and fuel grew scarce, ammunition was rationed, and mechanics worked miracles just to keep battered aircraft flying. He continued to fight, and his victories adding up, but every mission felt heavier, more desperate, and the faces around him changed constantly as young recruits were sent into combat with little training, many never returning from their first sortie, and the weight of command pressed down, and the realization that survival was become a matter of luck rather than skill haunted him. His luck ran out one afternoon when the squadron was ordered to intercept a formation of American bombers. And the sky was crowded with contrails, the air filled with flak and gunfire. Diving into the attack, he felt the familiar rush, but within moments his fighter shuddered violently. A burst of fire had torn through the engine, and black smoke poured into the cockpit, and controls became sluggish, alarm screamed, and he knew the machine would not carry him home. Forcing open the canopy, he threw himself into the rushing wind, and the parachute snapping open above him. Drifting down, he saw the battle rage on overhead, but his war was ending in a quiet field below. The ground did not welcome him kindly, and civilians spotted the insignia on his uniform and rushed toward him with fury. They shouted, struck him, spat in his face, and their anger born from nights spent under the bombs he had once defended. The blows rained down until American soldiers appeared, and pulling him away and binding his hands. He was now a prisoner, and with that realization came the deepest shame he had ever felt. And to be a captured Luftwaffe ace was to carry humiliation beyond words. Death in combat was honorable, captivity was disgrace in the camp, and he listened to rumors of executions and transfers east to the Soviets. Men whispered of starvation, of brutal labor, and of cold that gnawed at the bones until nothing remained. He expected little more than a long, slow death behind fences, stripped of purpose. But instead, his path diverged in a way he could never have foreseen. American intelligence had begun collecting not only aircraft and documents, but men. And they wanted to know how the machines worked, how the pilots fought, what secrets lay hidden in the cockpits of German jets. And operations with names never spoken aloud outside secret offices were already underway, gathering scientists, engineers, and flyers to bring them across the ocean. He was selected, pulled from the ranks of ordinary prisoners, and placed on a transport. When he arrived in America, and the land seemed impossibly vast, strange, and untouched by the war that had consumed his home. Most German prisoners were put to work in farms and factories, and living quietly under guard. But he was taken to guarded airfields, where captured aircraft had been rebuilt under American eyes. And the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, once symbols of terror, now bore new markings and stood as prizes of war. The Americans asked him to fly them, and to show their strengths and expose their flaws. They wanted demonstrations, explanations, the kind of knowledge that no manual could provide. And so, unbelievably, he climbed once more into the cockpits of the same machines he had flown in battle. Every flight was surreal. And he spoke with officers who had once been his sworn enemies, men who questioned him about tactics, about speed, about the art of combat. He demonstrated dives and rolls, evasions he had used to escape Allied fire, now teaching the very people he had once fought to defeat. Part of him recoiled at the betrayal, and another part knew that refusal meant being discarded, perhaps even death. Survival demanded cooperation, and survival had become his only compass. And yet he felt the cold stares, the quiet judgment from Americans who could not forget the sons and brothers lost to pilots like him. And he lived in a limbo where he was not a grad, not quite a prisoner, but something in between, a man too valuable to kill, and too mistrusted to be free. Was raised in a Germany that was still licking its wounds from the Great War, a country where bitterness and hope mixed uneasily. And children were taught that the nation had been betrayed, that dignity had been stolen, and that only strength could restore it. As he grew, and he watched with wide eyes the parades of soldiers, the speeches that promised revival, and above all the spectacle of machines that clawed into the sky with thunder. The Luftwaffe was new and dazzling, and for a boy who dreamed of more than village streets, the chance to join it was irresistible. Training began when he was barely a man, and it was merciless. And long flights pushed him until his body ached, instructors barked commands until every reflex was drilled into muscle memory, and accidents were frequent reminders that not everyone would survive even the preparation. Yet he endured, and when at last the badge of pilot was pinned to his chest, and he felt he had been chosen for something larger than himself, the war brought its own cruel education. In the early years, victory seemed effortless, and squadrons swept across Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying speed. He learned to duel in the sky, to read the movements of Spitfires, and Hurricanes, and later Mustangs, and he began to notch victories that earned him both respect and the hollow satisfaction of survival. And propaganda celebrated men like him, turning pilots into figures of myth. He felt pride when his name was mentioned. But even in those moments there was a shadow, because for every enemy that fell, another comrade was lost. And he learned to steel himself to the empty chairs at the mess hall, the lockers sealed forever, and the quick funerals whispered over wreckage. By the middle of the war, the illusion of invincibility was gone. The Allies filled the skies with endless bombers, and vast formations that blotted out the sun, and behind them swarms of escort fighters. German airfields were pounded day and night, fuel reserves dwindled, and engines failed for lack of parts, and pilots were sent up in aircraft patched together by desperate hands. And his missions became acts of endurance rather than glory. To climb into the cockpit was to wager everything, and he knew the odds leaned more heavily against him with every passing month. Still he fought, because stopping was unthinkable. And because survival was tied to loyalty and because the Luftwaffe demanded it. Then came the mission that ended his war, and, ordered to intercept another wave of American bombers, he climbed with his squadron into the cold blue. Tracer fire filled the air, and explosions blossomed around him, and in the chaos his aircraft was struck. Smoke poured into the cockpit, instruments flickered and died, and the stick shook in his grip. He wrestled with the machine, but it betrayed him, flames licking at the fuselage. With seconds to spare, and he flung himself into the rushing wind. The parachute snapped open, and he drifted down toward fields that no longer belonged to him. On the ground, and civilians rushed at him with rage, fists and boots punishing the uniform that marked him as an enemy. Blows fell, curses rang out, and he thought for a moment that his death would come not in combat, but in a muddy ditch. American soldiers intervened, dragging him away and shackling his hands. He was alive, but his freedom was gone. The camp was not what he had expected. He had braced himself for starvation, brutality, and perhaps execution. Instead, he found order, routine, a strange kind of stillness. Yet the humiliation of captivity cut deeper than hunger ever could. And he had been raised to believe surrender was dishonor, and now he sat behind wire, his fate in the hands of men he had tried to kill. And rumors spread among prisoners of summary executions, of transfers to Soviet camps where men vanished into snow and hunger, and of interrogations that broke spirits. He waited for the day his name would be called, and, fearing each morning that it might be his last, what came instead was something he could not have predicted. And the Americans had plans that stretched beyond the war itself. They combed through Germany's ruins, gathering machines and mines, seizing documents, prototypes, and the men who had built and flown them, jets, rockets, guided weapons, and designs that seemed to leap of their time, all fell into Allied hands. But blueprints could only tell so much, and they needed the knowledge of those who had lived in the cockpit, who had tested the limits with their own flesh. And so, quietly, and men like him were singled out. Instead of prison farms or endless confinement, he was shipped across the ocean and carried into a land untouched by the destruction that had scarred Europe. In America, he was brought not to a farm, but to airfields guarded closely, and where hangars held aircraft that once bore the black crosses of the Reach, the Messerschmitts, the Focke-Wulfs, and the jets that had terrified Allied crews now carried American markings, and engineers crowded around them with clipboards in hand. And they wanted to know everything, and he was expected to provide it. How they climbed, how they turned, what maneuvers could break pursuit, and how engines held under strain, what weaknesses pilots had whispered about in the barracks. Reluctantly he agreed, for he knew refusal carried risks, and survival demanded cooperation. Soon he was back in the cockpit, not as a warrior but as a test subject, and guiding the very machines he had once trusted with his life under the watchful eyes of former enemies. It was a strange existence. And to sit in a cockpit again filled him with a rush he could not deny, but each flight reminded him of the contradiction he embodied. And American officers who questioned him remained polite but distant, never allowing him to forget that he was still a prisoner and still a man who had fought for a cause they despised. Some civilians recoiled at the knowledge that German pilots were flying over American soil at all, and seeing it as betrayal of their dead. But to the strategist shaping the new order of the world, he was a resource too valuable to discard, and he lived in that uneasy space, tolerated but never trusted, useful yet always marked as the enemy he once was, and a man suspended between the pride of his past and the uncertainty of what awaited him next. He was born in a Germany where the memory of defeat was carved into the streets, and where men still spoke bitterly of the armistice and the humiliation that had followed. The world he grew into was one of promises, fiery speeches, and a vision of revival that carried with it the allure of power. Boys were told that sacrifice was noble, and that courage in service of the nation would restore honor stolen by outsiders. For many of them, and the sound of engines overhead stirred something deeper than mere curiosity. The Luftwaffe was young, modern, and proud, and its machines slicing through the sky like arrows of steel. For him, the path became clear, and though it was grueling, he followed it without hesitation. And training was relentless. Every hour in the cockpit pushed him to the limits of exhaustion, and every maneuver tested whether he belonged in the sky or on the ground with the many who washed out. There was no softness in the instructors, and only orders barked until his reflexes obeyed without thought. Crashes were common, funerals an expected rhythm, and yet he survived where many did not. And when he earned his wings, and he felt a surge of pride so powerful it seemed to justify every bruise and scar he had carried from training, he entered combat at a time when the Luftwaffe still carried its early aura of invincibility, and the Blitzkrieg campaigns filled Europe with fear, German aircraft dominating skies over Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries. And he flew missions that seemed almost effortless compared to what would come later, chasing enemy fighters and escorting bombers with confidence. And victories came quickly, and though he was far from the most celebrated of aces, and he proved his worth and earned respect among those who knew what it meant to survive even a handful of battles. And propaganda posters turned men like him into symbols of the new Germany, warriors who embodied courage, discipline, and skill. His own name began to circulate, and not loudly, but enough to carry with it a reputation that he felt both proud of and burdened by. And because every victory in the air was matched by the loss of comrades, men who shared barracks with him one day and whose lockers stood silent the next. And he learned to bury grief, to numb himself to the endless cycle of departures and absences. And because dwelling on the losses meant losing focus in combat, as the war dragged on, the balance of the skies shifted. The RAF adapted, and the Americans arrived in force, and soon the Luftwaffe faced odds that no pilot could ignore. And Allied bombers appeared in formation so vast that the horizon seemed blotted out, accompanied by fighters that only grew more advanced. And Spitfires gave way to Mustangs and Thunderbolts, machines with longer range, greater endurance, and sheer numbers the Germans could never hope to match. And fuel shortages crippled operations, forcing pilots into the air with barely enough for a single mission. Spare parts were scavenged, and engines repaired with desperation rather than precision. Still he fought, day after day, climbing into aircraft that shook and groaned, and aware that each sortie might be his last. Victories dwindled, defeats multiplied, and with them the realization that the war he had once believed was destined for triumph was spiraling into collapse. The mission that ended his fight came under skies heavy with contrails and smoke. Ordered to intercept a formation of American bombers, he and his comrades ascended into a wall of defenses. Flak exploded in black blossoms, and tracer fire cut across the blue, and the roar of engines merged into chaos. He dove into the fray, maneuvering with the instincts honed from years of combat, but in a moment it was undone. A burst tore into his aircraft, shattering controls, filling the cockpit with choking smoke. The machine bucked violently, and fire licking at its frame, and he knew it was finished. Tearing open the canopy, he hurled himself into the air, and the rush of wind deafening until the parachute snapped open and steadied his fall. Below him, the world looked quiet, and green fields stretching beneath the haze of war, but the peace was a lie. When he landed, civilians rushed toward him with fury in their eyes, and, recognizing the uniform, the insignia, the face of the enemy who had brought fire to their homes, they struck him, fists and boots, and curses hurled with each blow. For a moment, as pain blurred his vision, he thought his life would end not in glory, but in the mud of a field among strangers. And then American soldiers arrived, pulling him from the mob, binding his hands, and marching him away. Captivity was not death, but it was its own kind of destruction. In the camp he found routine, fences, and watchtowers, a world stripped of dignity. And he had been taught that surrender was dishonor, that a true pilot should never allow himself to be taken alive. Yet here he sat among thousands, and eating rations, listening to rumors, and waiting for a fate that seemed always just around the corner. Stories spread of executions, and of prisoners sent east to the Soviets, where camps swallowed men in cold and hunger until nothing remained. And he imagined the years ahead as a slow march into oblivion. Humiliation gnawed at him more deeply than hunger. He replayed missions in his mind, and, wondering if he should have fought harder, if he should have stayed with the burning wreck rather than leap into the air. But history does not pause for regrets, and his captors had plans that stretched far beyond vengeance. The Americans were already thinking beyond Berlin, beyond victory. They combed through the ruins of German airfields, laboratories, and factories, gathering not just machines but men. Jets, rocket planes, guided weapons, all spoke of a future war fought with technologies the Allies were desperate to master. And Operation Paperclip would carry scientists across the ocean to build rockets and missiles. And while Operation Lusty scoured Germany for aircraft and pilots who knew how to fly them. And his name appeared on a list, not because of his victories alone, but because of his experience. He had flown the machines they coveted. He knew their quirks, and their strengths, their flaws. Instead of fading into obscurity behind barbed wire, he was pulled aside, questioned, and eventually transported across the sea. America was vast, unscarred, almost alien to him. Where Europe's cities smoldered, here towns bustled in peace, and in fields stretched untouched by bombs. Many German prisoners worked quietly in farms and factories, labor exchanged for rations, and their lives reduced to monotonous safety. His was different. He was brought to guarded airfields where hangars held the trophies of war. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, even the rare jets, stood under new markings, studied by engineers with eager eyes. They wanted more than diagrams, and they wanted the voice of experience. They wanted him to explain how the aircraft felt when pressed to their limits, what maneuvers gave them advantage, and what flaws cost them lives. Reluctantly, and always with the knowledge that refusal might seal his fate, he complied. Once more he strapped into cockpits, and, feeling the familiar vibration of engines, guiding machines through American skies while officers watched, taking notes. And the same maneuvers he had once used to fight them now became lessons for their future pilots. His existence became a paradox. The thrill of flight remained, but it was haunted by the knowledge that he was no longer a warrior but a tool, his skills repurposed for those who had defeated him. And Americans treated him with caution, polite but distant, never allowing him to forget that he was still the enemy. Whispers followed him, and questions about loyalty, about whether such men could ever be trusted. Outside the bases, and civilians who lost sons and brothers to Luftwaffe bullets recoiled at the idea of German pilots flying under American protection. And yet the strategists who looked ahead to the rising tension with the Soviet Union saw only his usefulness. He was too valuable to discard, and too dangerous to ignore, trapped in a twilight existence where survival demanded cooperation, and where the past could never be escaped and the future offered no clear place for him. In the aftermath of the war, and as the ruins of Europe smoldered and millions tried to piece together broken lives, and his story stood as a strange reminder of how fate can twist itself into shapes that defy understanding. And he had once been the embodiment of a machine built for conquest, and a warrior trained to defend a vision of empire that promised eternity, but delivered only ruin. He had flown in the skies over shattered cities, and a symbol of a nation's ambition, and had been celebrated as a figure of strength. Yet, when the storm of battle passed, he found himself not executed, and not forgotten in a prison camp, but placed at the very heart of the world he had once sought to destroy. The contradiction was almost unbearable, and Yet it revealed something essential about the way history unfolds. America, victorious and ascendant, did not waste its time with vengeance alone. And it sought knowledge, it sought power, it sought the advantage that would define the wars of the future. And men like him became unwilling vessels of that ambition. Their memories of the Luftwaffe turned into lessons for a new generation of airmen. And in the hangars of the United States, in the cockpits of aircraft bearing stars and stripes, and he replayed the skills he had once honed against the very people who now demanded his expertise. To him, each flight carried the weight of irony. And the very tactics that had defended German skies were now ensuring American supremacy. And the very machines that had terrified his enemies were now dissected to strengthen them. But his story was more than a transaction of knowledge between defeated and victor. And it was a portrait of survival, of how a man raised in the crucible of ideology found himself reshaped by the cold demands of strategy. And he had entered the war believing in destiny, in duty, in the unbreakable power of his nation's will. By the end, he had been stripped of all illusions, reduced to a single question: how does one live when the cause that defined every breath has vanished into ashes? Captivity gave him no choice but to endure, and yet in that endurance he found a role he could not have imagined, and a role that tethered his survival to the very empire that had conquered him. His presence in America was controversial. There were whispers in mess halls, and bitterness among families who had buried sons, and anger at the thought that German pilots were given wings once more when so many Americans lay silent in their graves. But history is never simple, and the Cold War was beginning to cast its shadow, and in the looming confrontation with the Soviet Union, pragmatism triumphed over sentiment. Men like him, and once the enemy, were transformed into assets, not because they were forgiven, not because they were trusted, but because their knowledge could tilt the balance of the next conflict. In this uneasy bargain, he found both his curse and his redemption. To understand his journey is to confront the unsettling truth that wars are not only fought with bombs and bullets, but with ideas, with knowledge, with the lives of those who carry secrets in their minds. He did not choose to be spared, and he was chosen because he represented a piece of the future that the Americans needed. His survival was not a gift of mercy, but a calculation of necessity. And in that calculation lay the story of a man suspended between defeat and opportunity, condemned by his past, yet essential for what was to come in time. And as the years passed, his name faded from headlines, swallowed by the larger sweep of history. And yet the echo of his flights remained in the blueprints of American aircraft, in the tactics of their pilots, and in the very architecture of air power that would dominate the skies of the late 20th century. And he had not lived the fate expected of captured Luftwaffe aces, and his survival was neither heroic nor clean. It was tangled in compromise, in irony, and in the strange alchemy of history, where enemies can become teachers and survival can be bought by sharing the very skills that once made men lethal. His life reminds us that war is not only about winners and losers, and not only about nations and flags, but about individuals caught in currents larger than themselves. He was a soldier, a captive, a resource, and a symbol of how even in victory and defeat, the lines blur. His story forces us to look at the uneasy truth that morality often yields to pragmatism, and that survival often comes at the cost of dignity, and that the future is often built on the knowledge of men who once fought to destroy it. In the end, he became part of that future, not by choice but by necessity, a man whose wings had once carried the hopes of a reach, and now carrying the designs of a new world, a man who embodied both the ruin of the old order and the strange beginnings of the new.